And so the focus here is when I think of the respiratory chapter, this is a pretty challenging chapter. I think mainly because a lot of the concepts, while we understand breathing, because we have been doing it our entire life, it's requiring you to think about breathing in a lot of different ways and using a lot of new terminology. But additionally, what makes this chapter challenging is that it's a huge half packed full of anatomy, and then it's a huge half that is packed full of physiology. And thankfully, anatomy is pretty straightforward to understand. You just have to keep up with it. And so understanding that the purpose of the anatomical structures of the respiratory system is to assist getting air from your mouth into your lungs. And that's where the physiology part is going to take over. And that's what we're going to look at today, because I think the anatomy is much more straightforward, even though it is a lot. I'm not going to say that it's easy because it is a lot, but make sure you pay attention to your learning objectives on what you need to know with the anatomy. But then the physiology, the functional stuff can get a little confusing. And so I wanted to make sure that I give you an overview. Now, realize that even as I was going through this and kind of, not kind of, but very much simplifying it to this format over Zoom within about an hour, there is a lot that I'm either going to glance over very superficially or not even going to mention, but I want this video to be just that framework and that overview that will help you get to that deeper level of understanding. And at the end of the day, I would always rather you get a solid understanding of the superficial than try to spend all of your time understanding all of the details and end up being frustrated and not understanding anything anyway. And so I think after this short little lecture, however short it ends up being, or however long it ends up being, gives you that introduction and gives you a good foothold to follow up and ask me any questions that you have. So here we are with the respiratory system. Sure this works. Okay. So I kind of already mentioned this, that the organs of the respiratory system are designed to move air into and out of the alveoli, and then to allow for efficient exchange of gases. So we can think of those as kind of two broad functions of the respiratory system. So we see this relationship between the anatomy and the physiology, is that we have breathing. So this is air into and out of your lungs. Ultimately, we know this: oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. But then the other part of the respiratory system, where we actually get the name, is respiration, is that we need to exchange the gases. So we need to get oxygen from the outside air, get it into your bloodstream and get it to your tissues, to your cells. And we need to get carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, away from your cells, away from the tissues, get it back to the lungs so you can breathe out that carbon dioxide. So we see this relationship between breathing, moving air in and out, and then the actual work of respiration, which is moving those gases across the alveolar membrane and then also the tissue membrane. And this is where your book goes into sufficient detail on the coordination of the respiratory system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, and the cardiovascular systems. Because for all of this to work, you need all of these systems working together. You need bones to help the muscles move. The muscles have to move to be able to expand and contract your lungs to sort of let's say pulmonate. I don't know if that's even a word, but to move that air back and forth, you have to have a nervous system that tells those muscles to contract, to know how fast do you need to breathe, how slow do you need to breathe, how deeply do you need to breathe. And of course, you need the cardiovascular system to coordinate getting blood to pick up the oxygen, getting blood there to drop off the carbon dioxide. And this is moving throughout the entire body. So that ties into the cardiovascular chapters we just finished. Some other functions to not forget about with the respiratory system is the protection of the air passageway. So we think of the job of the bronchioles, of the trachea, of the lungs themselves. Also olfaction, of course, if you're smelling a candle, you're breathing in. Sound production, just like I am speaking now, we have the larynx, air moving over the larynx. And of course, if you're talking, if you're speaking, you're having to coordinate. When do you take a breath? How forcefully are you going to breathe out? Even down to the minutia of how are the muscles of your larynx moving your vocal cords, thick, thin, taut, to change the pitch of your voice. And then breathing is important, as we'll talk about right at the end of our lecture today, in blood pH regulation, that breathing actually helps determine how acidic your blood is. So as you breathe, you can actually adjust the pH of your bloodstream. So it becomes very important. Or on the conversely, if you're not breathing efficiently, it will cause your blood to become more acidic, which is a problem that was mentioned in the blood chapter. So here's the overview here. So when we look at the respiratory physiology, this is a figure out of your book that you can see. They break it up into 4 steps. I'm doing it just in 3 because alveolar gas exchange and systemic gas exchange, while the location is different, the physiology is the same. So as we go through this, and as you're reading and as you're studying, the most important thing to remember and to not get tripped up on is you need to keep track of the direction of gas movement. So the 2 gases we need to be aware of are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So think of oxygen as a good thing. And for this, we can think of carbon dioxide as a bad thing. And I guess maybe it's better to, because it's kind of wrong to call CO2 bad. It has other important things. CO2 is actually the main regulator of your breathing rate, so it is important. So maybe it's better to think of oxygen. I'm going to call oxygen a nutrient. Technically, it's not a biological nutrient, but we can call oxygen a nutrient, and we can call CO2 a waste product. So your tissues need oxygen, and they need to get rid of CO2. But I put the note here, simultaneous movement, because realize that it's not like a conveyor belt that you move the oxygen to the end and then you pick up carbon dioxide and you move carbon dioxide back. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving simultaneously throughout your body. So it's not like blood swishes one way to your feet and then it swishes back the other way to your lungs with carbon dioxide. Remember, it's a circle here, so everything's working simultaneously. So let's look at these as I broke it into 3 functions. But you can see here the first function of respiratory physiology, or kind of division here, is pulmonary ventilation. This is literally just getting air into and out of your lungs. You are ventilating. Whether you're doing that through your nose or through your mouth, a little bit of both. Pulmonary ventilation is just getting air into your lungs and getting it back out. So there are numerous conditions, such as like emphysema, that you can ventilate perfectly fine, but you have an issue with the gas exchange and the gas transport. But of course, to be able to exchange gases and to transport gases, you first have to get those gases into your lungs. And we'll look at this in more detail, but know while pulmonary ventilation is air into and out of your lungs, this is all based on what's called Boyle's law. And Boyle's law came into play in the cardiovascular system, which is talking about the relationship between pressure and volume. Then we get into gas exchange. This is literally moving the gases from one area to another across a membrane. So we exchange gases across the alveolar membrane, so alveoli to blood to alveoli, because remember, this is happening simultaneously. It's not we just do oxygen and then we do carbon dioxide. It happens simultaneously. So my little backslash there represents a membrane between the alveoli and the blood, and then we have another gas exchange membrane between the tissue and the blood. This is kind of described as the loading and unloading of gases. When you exchange gases, you are loading oxygen onto hemoglobin of the red blood cell, and you are unloading oxygen off of the hemoglobin. And then we'll also look at some carbon dioxide gets loaded and unloaded, but that's the phrasing, is that when you exchange it, you are loading or unloading the gases off of that hemoglobin. So you can think of the analogy is you are a delivery driver. And so as you go to different houses, at some houses you're picking up packages to send someplace else. and some houses you are dropping off. So it's happening simultaneously as that exchange. And this is described, kind of controlled by two laws, Dalton's law and Henry's law, which we will mention kind of superficially, hopefully just enough that you need to know. And then finally, we have gas transport. And so this is getting gases from the lungs to the tissues and then from the tissues back to the lungs. And so that's why the gas transport, you can say, exists between alveolar gas exchange and systemic gas exchange if you want to break those up separately, but you divide it however you feel is best. And once again, to the people here who are live in the Zoom, if you have a question, feel free to just put it in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. So just make a note, put it in the chat, and I can get to it at kind of the next stopping point. So let's look at pulmonary ventilation. Remember, this is basically breathing, getting air into the lungs. So remember, the lungs, those are the organs that are actually protecting the important respiratory structure. Specifically, that respiratory structure you're protecting is the alveoli, because the alveoli are the only structures in the respiratory system that can exchange those gases. So if you don't have alveoli, there's a part of the respiratory system that doesn't have the alveoli, you're not going to be able to exchange those gases. Let me switch over here. There we go. Hopefully you still will be able to see this as I just move that around. So breathing, getting air into the lungs, ultimately it's not good enough just to get air into your mouth or into your trachea. You need to get it down to the alveoli. And so this is where anatomically reference back to that bronchial tree. So you have the trachea, the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, the tertiary bronchi. I think it divides for 13 or 15 more branches until you get to those respiratory bronchioles. Specifically, that means you're starting to see alveoli. And so that anatomically, they divide it up into the, you have the respiratory structures and you have the conducting structures, the upper and the lower structures, however you want to divide it up. Just know that this is the whole point of pulmonary ventilation, is getting air all the way through those passageways to the alveoli. So then the question is, how do we get air from the outside into the lungs? And once again, this is one of those things you probably say, well, you just suck in the air, just like you're breathing through a straw. And in one sense, it is similar, but this is where we need to understand Boyle's law, which states that volume and pressure are inversely related. So here's the math equation for it. Pressure equals 1 over volume. We saw this in the heart. This means that if you decrease the volume, picture a balloon here, if you decrease the volume, or a water bottle maybe is best, if you decrease the volume, that means you're increasing the pressure. When you increase the pressure, you create a pressure gradient. So if you have your water bottle, you decrease the volume, pressure inside the water bottle goes up, the pressure outside in the air is the same, and so now water shoots out of the water bottle because it's going from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So you can see if we want to change the pressure, or let me start it this way, if we want to create a pressure gradient, then we need to change the pressure. And if we need to change the pressure, we must change the volume. I guess I can go even one step further to say if we want air to move, so if we want air to move into the lungs or we want air to move out of the lungs, we must create a pressure gradient. To create a pressure gradient, we must change the pressure. In this case, change the pressure in your lungs, because you can't change the pressure outside here very easily. And if we want to change the pressure in your lungs, we must change the volume. And that's where we get into that involvement with the muscular system, the musculoskeletal system, is that literally your muscles are pulling your lungs, increasing the volume of your lungs. You can picture like a slinky, you're pulling the volume of the lungs to increase the volume. If you increase the volume, pressure goes down. So now we've created a gradient, low pressure inside your lungs, high pressure, higher pressure in the outside air. So air is going to be to sort of be sucked in, just like when you're sucking water from a straw. And then when you breathe out, those muscles relax. Sometimes you even actively contract those muscles, decreasing the volume, increasing the pressure higher than the atmospheric air, and you breathe out. And that's exactly what we see in this image here, showing you change the volume, you change the pressure, all to create that pressure gradient. So I mentioned this, is that it's one thing to get air into the lungs, but not every respiratory structure has alveoli. So ultimately, we need to get the air, we need to get that oxygen to the alveoli, to the exchange surfaces of the respiratory system, because that's the only way we can get the carbon dioxide out and only way we can get the oxygen in. And so I compare this to an analogy if you're trying to feed a child. When we talk about getting air into the lungs versus getting it into the alveoli, it's the same thing as saying when you're feeding a kid, getting the food to the mouth versus to the stomach. Ultimately, when you are feeding a child, you're trying to get the food to the stomach, but you can't get to the stomach unless you first go to the mouth. But you know, just like in this image, that no matter how much food you feed a kid, if you have a 2-ounce jar of baby food, you are not going to get all 2 ounces into the stomach, right? Because some of it's going to get on the face, some of it's going to get stuck in their cheeks, around their gums, some of it may be hanging on to the back of their mouth, maybe that they're kind of coughing or choking on. So if we want to maximize the amount of food that gets to the stomach, we have to maximize the amount that gets to the mouth. So this is the same way as when we talk about the lungs versus the alveoli. And so we first have to get air into the mouth and fill up all of these respiratory passageways for it to have a chance to get to the alveoli. But ultimately, we want it to get to the alveoli. And so this is where we answer this question of what is the amount of exchangeable air at the alveolus? So you could be breathing in a large amount of air, but if it's not actually making it to the alveoli, then it's not exchangeable air, because you cannot move and exchange gases in the trachea, in the primary bronchi, in the secondary bronchi, and so on. You have to get to the respiratory bronchioles. So this is where we get to the first math equation is for pulmonary ventilation rate. So tidal volume times breaths per minute. This is the same math equation we saw with cardiac output. We have an amount, stroke volume, and a frequency, heart rate. So here we have an amount is the tidal volume. So this is like at rest as you're breathing in and out, but you can just think of it as how much are you breathing in, and then at what rate are you doing that? So on average, the tidal volume is 500 mLs. Breaths per minute is about 12. So you can do the math to figure that out. But you have to have a sufficient pulmonary ventilation rate. This is like the rate of how much food are we giving to offering the baby. But ultimately, we care about what is the rate as it's getting to the alveoli. So this is the alveolar ventilation rate. And this is the anatomical dead space. This would be if you've got your 2-ounce jar of baby food, how much food is going to get stuck on their face or in their nose or in their ear or left in their mouth. So that is, you got to just overcome that. You know that no matter how efficient you are, you're going to have to overcome some of that dead space. So in your respiratory system, that's the trachea, that's your mouth, that's all the bronchioles, all the way down to those respiratory bronchioles. So you can see on average, they calculate the dead space to be about 150 milliliters. So this is saying, in a sense, that if I'm offering 500 milliliters of food, I know no matter what I do, I have to at least offer 150 to overcome that dead space, because I know no matter what I do, I'm going to lose about 150 mLs of food. And so still the equation is the same, we're just overcoming that dead space. So as I said, if you have something like emphysema, you could have a very poor alveolar ventilation rate or gas exchange surface, even though your pulmonary ventilation rate could be very good. And so, or you could do something like very small breaths. You could have a high frequency and a low tidal volume that would give you a high pulmonary ventilation rate. But unfortunately, if you're not breathing more than 150, if you're not offering your body at least 150 mLs, you're not getting enough air to the alveoli. Sorry, my wife is texting me. Give me 1 second. So then that would be step one. If I can get back there, there we go. So that would be step one, is pulmonary ventilation, is understanding how do we get air into the lungs. Then we get to the next step, which is gas exchange. And I'm going to talk about both alveolar gas exchange and tissue gas exchange at the same time because the process is the same. And your book is going to go into more detail, on the numbers and understanding, but ultimately we're talking about gradients, just like we had pressure gradients before. We're going to look at a special type of pressure kind of concentration gradient here with gas exchange. So pulmonary ventilation only gets air into the lungs and to the alveoli. We need to get it into the blood, or vice versa, or conversely, if we are in the tissue chapter, or if we're in the tissues of the body, we got to get it from the tissues back into the blood. So at the lungs is what we call alveolar gas exchange. The oxygen needs to get into the blood, and we need to get the CO2 out of the blood. And so realize what I'm not including here is when we say oxygen needs to get into the blood, we're saying oxygen is leaving the alveoli to get into the blood. And when we say CO2 is moving out of the blood, it's moving into the alveoli, of course, to breathe out. At the tissues, it's kind of the opposite. So this is systemic gas exchange because we're at the tissue. So oxygen needs to get out of the blood and CO2 needs to get into the blood. So if we complete the sentence, at the tissues, oxygen needs to get out of the blood and into the working tissue, and CO2 needs to get out of the working tissue, since it's a waste product, and get into the blood. So that is the role of gas exchange. And so what determines how gases move? Well, gases move passively by diffusion, and how things move according to diffusion is high concentration to low concentration. So what determines the direction of gas movement? Well, as I said, in general, it's high concentration to low concentration. But how do we determine what that concentration is? And this is where we get what's called Dalton's law. Now, if you read in your book the definition of Dalton's law is very confusing. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But basically, Dalton's law allows you it's sort of like a giving you permission. Dalton's law gives you permission to convert the percentage of a gas into what's called a partial pressure. And think of this as like a concentration. And so mathematically, you can see that Dalton's law says, if you look at the atmospheric pressure, which on average at sea level, we're pretty close to sea level, is 760 millimeters of mercury, the atmospheric pressure equals the partial pressure, because if atmospheric pressure is the total pressure, each of these individually is called the partial pressure. So if we add up the partial pressures of all of these, we get the atmospheric pressure. So what you have to know is, what is the percentage of each of these gases in whichever location you're looking at, in the outside air, in your alveoli, in the blood. So in outside air, nitrogen makes up, interestingly, about 78-ish percent of the air that you breathe. Nitrogen gas is inert. It doesn't really do anything. We think of oxygen as being the most important, but oxygen really only makes up about 21% of the breathable air, and carbon dioxide makes up like whatever it is, like 0.03% or 0.3%, something very, very small. And then you have other gases as well. So what's the point of this? Or what's kind of the take-home message? So the analogy that I like to use for Dalton's law is winning the lottery. Let's say that somebody knocks on your door and says, congratulations, you have won the lottery. You go, great, how much did I win? And they say, you have won 60%. Well, you would say, well, 60% of what? Well, that's what Dalton's law is giving you permission to do, is to take that percentage and apply it to the bigger amount. Congratulations, you have won 60% of $100. Congratulations, you have won 60% of a 100-pound bag of horse manure for your garden. It's always the of what that's most important. And that's what Dalton's law allows you to do, is it allows you to take the percentage, because it's very easy to figure out percentages of gas. You can see those percentages in your book, but you can't work with a percentage because 60% is more of an idea. It's not something specific you can hold in your hand until you apply it to something. So each of those gases, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, has a percent out in the air. It has a percent sitting in your lungs. It has a percent in your blood. Dalton's law allows you to take that percentage and apply it to the overall pressure, percentage of pressure, to get that partial pressure. So that's why you could do the math. Just for instance, if atmospheric pressure on some unknown planet was 100 millimeters of mercury and oxygen made up 50% of that, well, then the partial pressure of oxygen is 50 millimeters of mercury, because that is 50% of the total amount, which is 100. Okay, so now that we have used Dalton's law to actually get something we can use, something tangible, and a partial pressure, now we can understand how things can go from high concentration to low concentration. So gases, oxygen is going to diffuse from the area of high partial pressure of oxygen to low partial pressure of oxygen. Carbon dioxide is going to go from the area of high partial pressure of carbon dioxide to low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. We now have to go the next step and go, what are some other factors that influence the movement of gases across that membrane? Because it's not just the pressure exerted. And so this is where we get into Henry's law. So you see kind of the verbiage here is the amount of gas movement is determined by the partial pressure, which is what we just looked at, that concentration gradient, that partial pressure gradient, and then the solubility of the gas. And this is called Henry's law. And so the analogy that I like to use here is if you have any siblings, maybe this will apply to you, or if you have your own kids, or obviously if you've been around siblings before. Henry's law, when we talk about solubility, is basically saying how agreeable is the child to listen to their parents. And so, like I said, if you have your own kids, you probably know this very well. If you have at least two, you can give one command to one child and she does it immediately. And you could give the same command to your other child and she will stare at you and yell no. So even though you are the same authority figure, you are applying the same partial pressure, the same concentration gradient, same pressure gradient to both children, even though you're applying that same pressure gradient to both children, they both respond differently because they have different agreeablenesses or different, in this case, solubilities. And so that's what Henry's law is talking about, is you can think about how easy it is for children to obey their parents. And so specifically, this applies to the fact that oxygen has a very low solubility in water or in the blood, and carbon dioxide actually has a very high solubility. So that means that you need to apply a much larger pressure gradient to oxygen to get it to move into the blood than you do carbon dioxide. Just like with one child, you have to apply a lot more pressure to get them to move because they're not as agreeable than you do to another child. You just have to maybe give them that look and they will go do what you want them to do. And so that's Henry's law. So Dalton's law gives us the partial pressure, which allows us to establish a pressure gradient. And then Henry's law tells us that based on that partial pressure and the solubility of the gas is going to determine how much of the gas of oxygen or carbon dioxide is actually exchanging between the lungs and the blood, the alveoli in the blood, or across the tissue membrane. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but this shows you in numbers exactly what I just talked about. So you can see here's in the alveolus, we have the partial pressure of oxygen, we have the partial pressure of carbon dioxide inside the alveolus, and then we can see blood coming to the alveolus. This is what would be considered deoxygenated blood. Notice the partial pressure of oxygen is 40, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45. So notice the gradient change. Oxygen is about 60, carbon dioxide is about 5, but all things being equal, we're exchanging an equivalent amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we have to apply a greater gradient to oxygen to get it to move because it has the lower solubility. It is less agreeable. And then you can see that the numbers are basically exactly reversed when we get to the tissues. So you can see 40 and 45 here, just like we saw 40 and 45 here. And then 95 and 40 and 104 and 40 it doesn't matter those specific numbers, but the idea is the same. We've got to establish that gradient to get the gas to move. So now that we have exchanged the gases, so remember if we're following a single oxygen molecule, we first breathed that oxygen molecule into the lungs, we got it to the alveoli, we have now gotten that oxygen molecule into the blood. Now we have to transport it and get it to the tissues that need it. So think of it this way, is you've got all of these cells of your body, but not all of the cells need the same amount of oxygen at any given time. So as I'm teaching, I'm moving my arms, the cells of my arms are going to need more oxygen than of my legs because the cells and tissues of my arms are working more at this time. So oxygen transport is going to tie in and kind of connect this gas exchange. So when we think of transport, oxygen loading and unloading is ultimately affected by the energy needs of the tissue. So as we're transporting, you can picture, here's oxygen on hemoglobin. Here's our little oxygen molecule sitting on hemoglobin. As it passes through the body, it's sort of looking for the tissue that needs the help. The analogy that I like to think about here is, let's say that you are indescribably wealthy, but you are also indescribably philanthropic. So you want to give your money away, but you only want to give your money away to people who need it most. So you are walking the streets of your town, you walk by the bank, you are deoxygenated, you don't have any money, and so you go to the bank and you fill up the money. So now you have loaded money onto your person, you have loaded money into your wallet, you've loaded cash into your wallet. Well, now you are walking through the streets of your town looking for people who need the money the most, because you're not going to give a large amount of money to somebody who doesn't need it. You want to give the money to the people who need it. And so you're holding on to it to look for those people who are in need. So when we talk about that, ultimately this is affected by the energy needs of the tissue. Think about this. What are the signs of a working tissue? And what are the signs of a resting or a happy tissue? And so think about it this way. What are the signs of a runner who looks exhausted? Well, we have a picture here. You're laying on the ground, you're bent over, you're heaving, maybe your face is flushed, versus what are the signs of somebody who's relaxed? Sorry, I think somebody just wants to join in, but let me see. Guess not. Heard a noise. And so what are the signs then of somebody who looks relaxed? Well, let's look at what are those signs of a working tissue. And so the different signs you can hold would be, are that your body is looking for, this wealthy benefactor, this rich person is looking for, is what is the oxygen level of the tissue? What is the carbon dioxide level of the tissue? And what is the hydrogen ion level of the tissue? And then what is the temperature? So you can think of these as four important markers that cells are holding. So if you think of maybe a cell is holding four billboards for each of these and can basically determine, are these high or low? So if we work through these, which ones would be signs of a working tissue? So high or low. So if you are a working tissue, so here you are, you're exercising. What are the oxygen levels going to be in that working tissue? And I actually give you just, maybe you want to pause it here just to think through this. If you are a working tissue, are you going to have high or low oxygen levels? If you are a working exercising tissue, are you going to have high or low CO2 levels? If you are a working tissue, you're going to have high or low hydrogen ion levels, and what is your temperature going to be? So maybe if you want to think through it, you can pause it. For, of course, those live here, I'm going to just keep going through it. So if you are a working tissue, you are going to have a high oxygen level. Excuse me. If you're a happy tissue, you're going to have oxygen. If you are a working tissue, you are going to be a high consumption of oxygen, meaning if you are a working tissue, you're going to have a low oxygen level in that tissue. So if you're working, you're going to have a sign that says low oxygen here. Just like our analogy, if you are, it's like being poor, you have a sign that says, I have low amount of money. I have a low amount of money in my bank account. That's what your sign says. If you are a working tissue, you're going to have a high amount of waste product. You're going to have a high CO2 level. So you're going to have another sign that says CO2 level high. If you're a working tissue, hydrogen ion is also a waste product. Go back to your biology class to lactic acid production. You are going to have a high hydrogen ion concentration. So you have another sign that says high hydrogen ion. And then think about, just like with our runners here, what is their temperature when they are working? They're going to have a high temperature. So tissues that are working are also going to have a high temperature. So if you are an oxygen, hemoglobin loaded, packed full of oxygen, you're going to be floating through the body down the bloodstream looking for tissues that have a low oxygen level, a high CO2 level, a high hydrogen ion level, and a high temperature. So when you come into contact with a tissue with those conditions, you are going to be more than happy to unload all of your oxygen. If you come to a tissue that has the opposite of that, high oxygen, low CO2, low hydrogen, low temperature, well, you're going to hold on to it because you don't really need it. And so remember, when we talk about oxygen transport, this is loading and unloading, which gets into gas exchange, but basically 98% of all oxygen in your bloodstream or in your body is carried by hemoglobin. So that's called hemoglobin saturation, I think. Yeah, so that gets us to this chart. It shows us, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see percent saturation. If you ever used an oximeter, you're looking for somewhere between like 96 and 100% oxygen saturation. So percent O2 saturation of hemoglobin, what's the partial pressure in that, or depending on the partial pressure in that area, what is the percent saturation? So we saw a couple slides ago that it was like 104 right at your lungs. So you can see when you are fully loaded up, here is our wealthy benefactor who doesn't have any money, goes to the bank, and he loads up nearly to 100%. And that's what we can see here. PO2 is 100, percent saturation is 98. If you also go back to that image couple before, at the tissues, it's about 40 or 50 partial pressure of oxygen. Well, notice in a typical working tissue, you only give up, your cell only gives up, your hemoglobin only gives up 1 oxygen. Because if you go back to the blood chapter, hemoglobin, molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen. So we go from about 100% to about 75%. So you give up 1 of the 4. So you go from here to about here. The steep slope of this graph means that in the tissues that need it most, hemoglobin gives up the most oxygen. So this is the same thing as we have our incredibly wealthy guy who's walking through the town, that he is going to be more willing to give up, or when he encounters people with the most poverty, he is going to be even more willing to give up the money. When we look at carbon dioxide transport, you can see here about 10% of your carbon dioxide is dissolved in plasma and just floats that way. About 20% is just bound not to the heme and hemoglobin where oxygen is, but to the just to the hemoglobin itself. But the majority of carbon dioxide is gets converted into bicarbonate. And this is going to be a topic that is going to come into a lot more detail. I can't remember the chapter number, but when we talk about fluid and pH balance, but this is called the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. And so we have water. When you can take water in the presence of carbon dioxide, and this enzyme carbonic anhydrase will smush them together and create carbonic acid, which will then as an acid dissociate into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So you can see here there's a connection between CO2 on the left side and hydrogen ion on the right side. And this goes all the way back to the first slide where I talked about the relationship between CO2 and hydrogen ion. The more CO2 that exists in your body, the more that it's going to get smushed into water and get turned into hydrogen ion. So just in short, this is our last slide to close, is that the higher the CO2 level in your bloodstream, the lower your pH. Or remember, low pH means high hydrogen ion concentration. Low pH means more acidic. So the terms here, your book goes into more detail on this to explain the relationship, or certainly reach out, that just gets beyond the scope of this lecture, is that when we hyperventilate, so hyperventilate means we're ventilating more air. You understand hyperventilating. This is called hypocapnia. That means low CO2. You are breathing out CO2. So that means the CO2 level goes down. When CO2 goes down, hydrogen ion concentration goes down, so pH goes up, and this is called alkalosis. So when you hyperventilate, you create what's called respiratory alkalosis. Your blood becomes too basic. Hypoventilation, maybe this is holding your breath or not breathing very much at all. This is hypercapnia, high CO2, what we just learned, increasing CO2 level, increases hydrogen ion concentration, which is a lowering of pH, and it increases acidity. So there is our marathon overview of respiratory system and those functions. And so I want to close just kind of where we started here as we walk through the different steps. Pulmonary ventilation, moving the air in and out, literally just getting it to the lungs. Gas exchange, how are we moving it across that membrane? And then gas transport, what are the factors and what are the things that influence the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the alveoli to the tissues and back? So I know that was a lot. Of course, it's recorded, so rewatch it, read, do your homework. But I hope that this will not only increase your understanding, give you a framework for kind of putting together some of the things that you've learned, but also give you a foothold and a good foothold for questions that you have to ask. And so feel free to reach out for a Zoom or to email me if you have any questions.